She knew the law. She enforced the law. But when a power-hungry officer pulled her over and refused to acknowledge who she was, things took a dangerous turn, and karma hit back hard. The road stretched out before her, nearly empty, just a ribbon of highway cutting through the night. Streetlights flickered by, their glow reflecting off the sleek black sedan, gliding steadily in the right lane. Veronica Caldwell had been driving for nearly an hour, her mind still occupied with the classified briefing she had just left. As the newly appointed FBI director, long hours and even longer nights were part of the deal, but she was accustomed to that. What she wasn't prepared for, however, was the sudden burst of red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, her eyes flicking to the speedometer. Exactly 65, not a mile over. No erratic movements, no reason to be pulled over. Yet the police cruiser behind her remained close, not budging. She exhaled sharply and signaled to the right, guiding her car to the shoulder of the road. Years of experience told her there was no immediate cause for concern. She had worked alongside law enforcement her entire career, understood the protocol, and knew the system well. But as the patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, something gnawed at the back of her mind. Why was the officer taking his time? Too much time. She adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of him. The driver's side door of the cruiser finally swung open. The man who stepped out wasn't someone she recognized. Not surprising. She didn't make a habit of knowing every street cop in the state, but something about the way he moved unsettled her. His posture was rigid, almost aggressive. His left hand rested on his belt, fingers curled near his firearm, while his right hand swung a flashlight back and forth as he walked toward her window. She pressed the button to lower the glass, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice calm and professional. The man peered down at her, the light flashing across her face for just a bit too long, too intrusive. "License and registration," he said. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. Just the demand. Veronica held back a sigh. This wasn't normal. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" she asked evenly. The officer chewed his gum, staring at her a moment longer than necessary before repeating his request. "License. Registration." Veronica didn't move right away. Her instincts, the same ones that had saved her life more than once, told her this wasn't going to be routine. She needed to control the situation before it escalated. "Sir, I'm reaching for my purse on the passenger seat," she said, speaking carefully. No response. Slowly, she retrieved her wallet and offered both her FBI credentials and her driver's license. The officer didn't take them. His eyes flickered across the ID, then back up to her, his expression unchanged. "FBI, huh?" She nodded once. "Yes, sir." Silence hung in the air for a beat, then came the command that made her blood run cold. "Step out of the vehicle." The words were quiet but hit like a slap. Veronica blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me?" The officer took a half step back, his right hand hovering near his firearm. "Step out." The tension thickened, pressing against her ribs. There was no reason for this. She had followed the protocol, had identified herself. Yet this man, this officer, was treating her like a threat. Veronica had seen this before. Not personally, not like this, but she had read the reports, seen the footage. She was not about to become another headline. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind was already working through her options. She knew how quickly things could spiral out of control, but she also knew how to survive. Before she could decide on her next move, the officer's patience snapped. He reached for the door handle, and that's when she realized this wasn't just a traffic stop. This was something else entirely. But Veronica wasn't going to let fear dictate what happened next. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The click of the door handle sent a jolt through her body, not fear, but a sharp awareness. Her left hand shot out, gripping the inside handle before Officer Daniel Kearns could pull it open. "Sir, step back," she ordered, her voice firm but controlled. "You are outside of protocol." Kearns didn't move. If anything, his grip on the door tightened, his knuckles turning white under the strain. "I said step out of the car." Now she could hear the edge in his voice, the control he was trying to exert. Veronica had dealt with men like him before, men who mistook authority for dominance, who pushed boundaries to see how far they could get. But this wasn't some power-hungry bureaucrat in a suit. This was a man with a badge, a gun, and a temper that made him dangerous. She tightened her grip on the door handle. "On what grounds, officer?" For the first time, Kearns hesitated. His lips parted as if scrambling for a response. But instead of an answer, there was only silence. He did something worse. He took a step closer. The flashlight remained in his left hand, aimed directly at her face, blinding her to everything but his silhouette. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he muttered, his voice flat. Veronica didn't blink. In fact, she countered calmly, "You do." The beam of light didn't waver, but she could feel the irritation in his jaw as it clenched. His composure was slipping away. "Lady, I don't give a damn who you work for." Her heartbeat stayed steady, controlled. But the reality of the situation was shifting. This wasn't just a simple display of aggression. It wasn't a cop overstepping his authority. He was trying to provoke fear. And fear was something Veronica Caldwell did not allow herself to feel. "Then let's call your superior and see if he gives a damn," she said coolly. Her words set him off. The flashlight dropped, and before she could even react, his free hand slammed against the roof of her car with a force that was violent. The sudden bang cut through the night, a sharp, jarring sound that echoed down the empty stretch of road. "I said get out," he barked. For the first time, Veronica glanced at his nameplate. D. Kearns. She would remember that name. Her fingers itched to grab her phone, to document everything. But she knew any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. She had seen it too many times. So she kept her hands visible, both on the steering wheel, and leveled him with a look she had perfected during countless interrogations. The kind of look that stripped a man bare, exposing the truth of who he was. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. Kearns let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Number. The mistake was thinking you could pull rank on me." That's when she noticed it. The shift in his stance, the way his right hand twitched near his belt. He was considering it. And in that moment, the air between them thickened, growing heavy with danger. Then a second car pulled up, the red and blue lights sweeping across the scene as another patrol unit rolled to a stop behind Kearns' cruiser. For the briefest moment, Veronica felt relief. Another officer meant a witness. It meant accountability. But then she saw who stepped out. Another white officer. Tall, broad-shouldered. No nameplate visible in the glare of the headlights. Kearns didn't even glance back. That told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't backup. This was reinforcement. The second officer strode up beside Kearns, his eyes flicking between them before settling on Veronica. "Problem here?" he asked, his tone flat. Kearns smirked. "Just dealing with a non-compliant driver." Veronica stayed silent for a fraction of a second, weighing her options. She was outnumbered now, and Kearns knew it. The second officer took a step closer. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." Not FBI Director Caldwell. Not even Miss Caldwell. Just ma'am. Veronica had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't a hostile negotiation overseas. This wasn't a tactical mission gone wrong. This was home, and right now, home felt just as dangerous. She inhaled slowly, calculating her next move. If she made the wrong one, she wouldn't be the one writing the report tomorrow. They would. The tension settled deep into her bones, thick and suffocating. The second officer positioned himself slightly behind Kearns, a silent show of solidarity. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about power. Her fingers remained resting against the steering wheel, her mind calculating every potential outcome. If she refused, they would escalate. If she complied, she was at their mercy. There was no good choice. "Ma'am," the second officer repeated, his voice deceptively calm. "Step out of the car now." Veronica exhaled slowly through her nose. Her pulse was steady, despite the warning signs flashing at her. She had been in negotiations where a single wrong word could get someone killed. She needed to stay in control. With deliberate slowness, she reached for the door handle, keeping her other hand raised in clear view. Kearns stepped back slightly, giving her just enough room. The moment her feet hit the pavement, the cold night air bit against her skin, amplifying the adrenaline already burning through her veins. She was vulnerable now. Kearns towered over her, his body angled just enough to block the dashcam's view. The second officer stayed a step behind, covering any blind spots. She had no doubt they had done this before. "Turn around," Kearns ordered. Veronica didn't move. "You haven't told me why I'm being detained," she said evenly. Kearns's nostrils flared, his face hardening. "Suspicious behavior." "What behavior?" she asked, her voice even, refusing to let him take control of the narrative. He smirked, shaking his head as if she were just another problem to deal with. "Refusing to comply," he muttered, like it was a trivial offense. It was a trap. Refusing to comply would give him an excuse to escalate. Complying would mean submission. She knew the game. She had read the reports. And then, before she could react, Kearns grabbed her wrist. Too hard, too fast. Her instincts kicked in immediately. Her body shifted just enough to pull back without appearing aggressive. "Get your hands off me!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the night like a whip. Kearns didn't let go. The second officer took a step closer. "We got a problem here?" the second officer asked, his hand inching toward his radio. Kearns's grip tightened. "I think she's resisting." The words made Veronica's stomach turn. Already parting to say the words that had justified so many senseless escalations before. "We have a non-compliant suspect." Suspect. Not citizen, not FBI director, just suspect. And then the gun came out. Kearns didn't hesitate. His hand dropped to his holster, unfastened the snap, and before she could even react, the barrel was inches from her face. Time stretched, warping around them. Veronica had been trained for crisis situations. She had faced cartel leaders, domestic terrorists, and violent criminals. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a road in the middle of nowhere, and she was unarmed. Her breath stayed even, her hands raised, palms open. Everything in her body told her to move, to react. But she knew how that would end. The silence was suffocating. Then Kearns spoke. "Do you feel powerful now?" Veronica felt something inside her shift. This had never been about a traffic stop. This was about humiliation. Her vision tunneled for a split second, not from fear, but from rage. Not for herself, but for every name she had seen on reports just like this. For the people who never got to tell their side of the story. She opened her mouth, choosing her next words carefully, because they could be her last. But before she could speak, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, I'm recording this!" The shout came from somewhere off to the side, piercing through the thick tension like a blade. It wasn't just the words, it was the force behind them. Somebody had seen, and more importantly, somebody had proof. Kearns didn't lower his gun, but the shift in his stance was immediate. A flicker of hesitation, a quick glance toward the voice. Veronica followed his gaze, barely turning her head. A man stood near the edge of the road, phone raised, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. He was at a safe distance, but close enough for every detail to be captured. Close enough for the world to see. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" the man called out, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Kearns's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. The second officer took a step forward, shifting as if considering damage control. They weren't in control anymore. Veronica saw it in their eyes, the calculation, the panic pressing against their authority. They had gotten comfortable in the shadows, in the silence of unrecorded incidents. But this was different. Kearns exhaled sharply, his fingers still curled around the grip of his gun. His next move would determine everything. Veronica knew she had to push. "Put the weapon down!" Her voice cut through the air, stronger than before. Kearns didn't move. His breathing was shallow now, his mind working overtime to figure a way out. The second officer's radio crackled. "Unit 47, status?" Another heartbeat of silence, then more sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. Reinforcements, but not the kind they wanted. Kearns's grip finally loosened. His hand dropped slightly, not holstering the weapon, but no longer aiming it directly at her. He turned to the second officer. "Get him to stop recording," Kearns ordered. Veronica's stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. The second officer moved toward the witness, a hand reaching for something on his belt. "Number not this time." Veronica took a step forward, her voice sharper than before. Touch him, and I will personally have you charged with obstruction of justice. That stopped him for the first time. There was uncertainty in the air now. The power dynamic had shifted, even if just slightly. The sirens were closer now, seconds away. Kearns wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking past her, toward the oncoming lights. His mind was already spinning, searching for an exit strategy. Veronica knew that look. Desperation. Desperate men made reckless choices. She had seconds to make sure she got out of this alive. But would that be enough? The sirens were deafening now. The flashing lights bounced off the pavement as multiple squad cars skidded to a stop. The witness kept his phone steady, the red recording light glaring like an unblinking eye. Veronica didn't dare move. Kearns was still holding the gun, but his stance had changed. The confidence, the untouchable arrogance, had drained from his face, replaced with something tighter, something bordering on panic. Doors flew open, officers poured out, hands hovering near their holsters, but not drawn. They didn't know what they were walking into. Then one of them recognized her. Director Caldwell. The name ripped through the tension like a bullet. Kearns barely reacted, but the second officer stiffened. His mouth parted, but no words came out. The officer who had spoken, a lieutenant, judging by the insignia on his uniform, looked between them, taking in the scene. Veronica standing with her hands up, Kearns still gripping his weapon, the second officer hovering, unsure of what to do next, and the witness's camera rolling, documenting every second Veronica took. The moment she dropped her hands to her sides, not in surrender, but in control. Lieutenant, I want these officers detained right now. The command was clear, unshaken. The second officer took a step back. Hold on, the lieutenant started, but before he could utter another word, Veronica snapped. Not another word. Her voice was razor sharp, cutting through whatever excuse he had been about to throw out. I know exactly what this was, and so does he. She motioned toward the witness whose phone was still locked on them. The lieutenant hesitated. Veronica could see the gears turning in his mind. This wasn't just a bad stop. This was a career-ending disaster for whoever let it slide. Kearns must have realized it too. His fingers finally uncurled from the gun, and he let it drop back into the holster. His movements were slow, controlled, but his expression? It was seething. Veronica held his gaze. This time, she wasn't the one afraid. This is a misunderstanding, Kearns finally muttered, his voice low, like he knew the excuse sounded pathetic. Veronica tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. Oh? Then let's clear it up at headquarters. Call internal affairs. Call the DA. This isn't going away. The second officer swallowed hard. His face had gone pale. The lieutenant finally moved, turning toward the closest officer. Cuff them both, Kearns snapped. You've got to be kidding me. His voice was raw, full of disbelief. The kind that comes when a man who's gotten away with everything suddenly realizes he won't. This time, Veronica didn't flinch. You pulled a gun on the director of the FBI, Officer Kearns. Let me know if you'd like to add resisting arrest to the list. She had spent her entire career watching justice almost happen, watching cases get tangled in red tape, watching victims be treated like suspects, but not tonight. Kearns was still breathing hard when the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The second officer didn't resist. He just stared at the ground, like a man who had finally realized he had bet on the wrong side. The lieutenant turned to Veronica. Director, are you? Get them out of my sight, she said flatly. And just like that, it was over. Or at least this part was, because Veronica knew this wasn't just about two bad cops. This was about a system that let them thrive, and she wasn't about to let that slide. But what came next? That was even bigger than tonight. The cuffs around Kearns' wrists weren't just metal. They were the weight of consequences, the kind he had avoided his entire career. He stood rigid, his face twisted with disbelief as officers led him and his partner toward the waiting squad cars. He still thought this wouldn't stick. Veronica had seen that look before. Men like him always believed they were untouchable until they weren't. She took a slow breath, willing herself to stay composed. Anger wouldn't serve her now. Action would. The witness was still standing on the shoulder of the road, his phone now lowered but still recording. His gaze met hers. You good? He asked. Veronica nodded. Thanks to you, she said quietly. He hesitated before responding. They do this all the time, just not to someone like you. That stung in a way she hadn't expected. Because he was right. This wasn't new. She just happened to have the power to do something about it. More officers arrived, some of them eyeing Kearns and his partner with barely concealed judgment. The lieutenant who had taken charge earlier walked back toward Veronica. Director Caldwell, he started carefully, do you want to press charges personally or? Veronica shook her head. This isn't personal. This is systemic. I'll be filing an official report first thing in the morning, and I want internal affairs involved immediately. The lieutenant exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Understood, he said. She wasn't finished. I also want access to both of their disciplinary records. Full transparency. The lieutenant hesitated. Veronica leveled him with a stare. If you think I'm letting this get buried, you don't know who you're talking to. Silence followed, then reluctant agreement. I'll make the call. Good. Because this wasn't just about one traffic stop. This was about all the ones that never got recorded. The footage hit the news before dawn. By noon, the Justice Department had announced a formal investigation. Kearns was stripped of his badge and booked for assault with a deadly weapon. His partner was suspended indefinitely. The police department released a public statement, one of those carefully worded damage control kind of statements. But the world had already seen the truth, and the truth had consequences. Veronica watched the coverage from her office, her fingers steepled under her chin. The story was spreading fast, and she knew what came next. The calls, the press conferences, the political maneuvering from people who would pretend to care while silently wishing she had just let it go. But she wasn't letting anything go. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Normally she wouldn't answer, but tonight she did. Director Caldwell? A pause, then a familiar voice. The witness from that night. Just wanted to say, I appreciate what you're doing. Most people wouldn't. Veronica leaned back, a slow breath leaving her chest. Most people don't have the power to. She paused, then quietly added, but I do. For the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope. Justice doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people refuse to look away. Make sure you're paying attention. If this story moved you, share it. Speak up and never let the truth go unheard.